honored to be here. And then despite all those fires and closed highways, I'm glad I made it. So let me introduce our Future of Asia research series. So this is one of many Future of Asia series. Our first report was released about a month ago, which is about the flows and network in Asia. Our second module will be about corporate ecosystem, so how Asian companies are performing and how whether the Asian corporate model will still stay relevant in the future. The third module will be about technology, where Asia is leading in terms of technological innovation and where it will lead in the future. And the final module will be about Asian consumers. So today is about our first module, flows and network. And let's think about what is happening in the world right now. Right? So if you look at the U.S. economy, what do you see today in the U.S.? What do you see? You guys are in the U.S. Tech, a lot of tech. Yeah. How about GDP growth, economic growth? It's good. It's slowing down, but good, right? It's a 10 years of expansion, right? Record high, right? But then also, there is a so-called inverted yield curve, right? So that is suggesting something may be coming up, right, in the U.S., right? And what about Europe? What is happening in Europe?
Slow down.
Yeah, slower down, right? And the German economy actually contracted in the second quarter, right? And ECB is announcing negative interest rates, right? So maybe the economic growth potential in the future may not be there's a lot of uncertainty, right, in Europe as well, right? So then where should we look to? Asia. So let's talk about the future of Asia. So that was our thinking process, right, in terms of defining our research. I brought 6 messages, and then let me talk through one by one. The first one is about the Asian century, right? So the Asian century has already arrived, right? That is because Asia today is already the largest economy in the world, right? So in terms of GDP, it is already in terms of PPP basis, it is already more than 40% of the global GDP, and it is likely to be over more than 50% by 2040. Right? And then I work in China, but I grew up in Korea, right? And then also many of my Asian friends and colleagues, they have gone through transformational stages, right, in terms of where they live, and this is an example, right? So this is where I work. Could you guess where this is? Shanghai, right? So where? Shanghai, which part of Shanghai? Pudong, right? The left-hand side is Pudong back in 30 years, yeah, 1990s, right? So there was almost nothing, but then today, almost everything, right? So whenever I use this slide, I have to update this slide because there's new building, right? So, being built, right? And then the GDP of Pudong alone is almost like as large as the GDP of the Hungary, for example. Right? So this is Shanghai. How about this? Seoul. Right? So do you know the song Gangnam Style? Yeah. So this is Gangnam, right? So back in 60s and 60s and 70s, right? And then today, right? How about this? Jakarta, yeah, exactly. Right? So Jakarta, I can go on and on, right? Kuala Lumpur, right? And Hanoi, and so on, right? So lots of the economic development has been happening, and then that have transformational impact on the people living in those cities, right? And then in the future, we believe that the momentum can continue, and then there is a very good chance that Asia still remain as the largest economy in the world, right? So the Asian century has already arrived, right? So that is our first message. And then also what is interesting is that Asia is becoming more Asian. Right? So Asia is becoming more Asian, and we analyzed about 8 dimensions and 16 flows, and then found out that a lot of the other flows happening in Asia is becoming bigger, right? So in terms of trade, capital, people, knowledge, transport, and so on and so on. So Asia is becoming bigger in terms of those, all those different dimensions of flows. And why do we believe Asia is becoming more Asian? Because there is a very strong trend of intra-regional connections, intra-regional networks, right? So for example, in terms of global trade, about 60% of the total trade happening in Asia are intra-regional basis. In terms of FDI investment, 59%, startup investment 71%, people flow 74%, right? So Asia is getting more and more connected to each other, right? So Asia is becoming more Asian, right? So then what does that mean? What does that mean? What does that mean?
That money is staying in the area.
Yeah, the money is staying
There's more growth.
in the area, yes, and then more growth, right? And then we talked about global volatilities and uncertainty, right? That means that this may create stronger incentives for Asian countries to collaborate with each other, and then potentially make the region more resilient to global volatilities, right? So we talked about the increasing flows in Asia, with the exception of this. What is this? So this is the plastic waste, right? So along those the flows that we analyze, this is the only flow that declined in Asia, right? So Asia used to account for 71% of the waste import, now 70%, right? And then Asian countries becoming richer and middle class rise. So this will this trend may continue, and then especially from Western country perspective, this can cause disruption. So that's what we see in terms of the Asian flows, right? So that was about the Asian century. Then let's talk about what is Asia. Right? So what is Asia? Right? So how many people are living in Asia today? 3 billion. So it depends how you define, what Asia is, right? So maybe, more than 4 billion, right? And then how many languages?
Hundreds.
Too many languages, right? So probably over 2,000, right? So over 60 countries, right? So, and then the GDP per capita gap between Singapore and then Nepal will be more than 10 times, 60 times, right? So Asia is very, very, very diverse. So what is Asia, right? So there will be many different ways of defining Asia, and then we thought about 4, right? We thought about at least four different Asia: advanced Asia, China, emerging Asia, and frontier Asia and India, right? So we thought about there will be at least 4 different Asias, and then each of these Asia will be as large as the continent. Large as the continent by 2040, right? So we talk about Latin American strategy, right? Middle East strategy, right? The African strategy, right? So yes, those strategies matter, but Asia will be as large as combination of those continents, right? So that's the opportunity, that's the growth that we are talking about. And then why we define these 4 different Asia, there could be multiple dimensions. The first dimension could be scale. So and China stands out in terms of scale, and another dimension could be economic development, right? So that makes advanced Asia also a separate group, and then also third dimension is interaction with the world, right? So among Asian countries, especially the emerging Asian countries in Southeast Asia, they interact with the rest of Asia very, very heavily, right? So about 70 to 90% of the trade flow, capital flow, people flows are happening on the intra-regional basis, whereas frontier Asia and India, less so, right? So that's why we thought about defining this 4 different Asia. But then what does that mean? What does 4 different Asia mean? Is that a good thing or bad thing, or what is the implication of this? So we think that there's another very interesting characteristics about Asia is that the countries are very complementary, right? So especially these 4 different Asia, they are quite complementary, right? So if you look at the market growth, for example, right? So advanced Asia, the growth of advanced Asia will slow down, maybe 1 to 2%, right? But then China, emerging Asia, and frontier Asia, they may be able to sustain their growth momentum at around 4 to 6%. So it offers lots of interesting and attractive growth opportunities for advanced Asia. If you look at labor, right? So China and advanced Asia are going through a rapid aging stage, right? So they are losing their demographic dividend. whereas the emerging Asia and frontier Asia, they can still enjoy young population and massive urbanization. If you look at capital, advanced in Asia and China, they are the investors, right, across Asia, whereas the other Asias, they are on the receiving side, and so on and so on, right? So these 4 different Asia, they are quite complementary, right? So that this again, creates an incentive for Asian countries to collaborate together and form interesting, networks and flows, right? So that is our second message, right? So there are 4 Asia, those are very diverse but very complementary. Then let's talk about 3 interesting networks generated out of this the Asian flows. The first one is about industrialization, and let me start with an example between China and the rest of Asia. Right? So China is gradually phasing out of the labor-intensive tradables, and they want to do more knowledge-intensive stuff. And this is what we see. If you look at the export of the emerging markets, right? So China, the Chinese share out of the emerging market export in the labor-intensive tradable categories declined by about 3 percentage points. And all of those those spaces created by China were taken by other Asian countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, Bangladesh, and so on and so on. Right? And then also the recent trade disputes between China and the U.S. Right? That is actually accelerating this trend. Right? So 30 to 50% of the executives in China say that they may relocate their supply chain, and then 50 to 70% of them are saying that Southeast Asia could be a top choice. Right? So there is this the shift of industrialization network is happening in Asia. So that's one example. Another example is the corridors, the new corridors between the advanced Asia and also the other Asia. And this is an example of Korea and Vietnam corridor, right? Especially in the electronics sector. About 79% of the Vietnam's electronics FDI is coming from Korea, and that helps Vietnam become the exports engine of the world in terms of computers and electronics, right? And then probably Samsung is a Korean company, very big in Korea, but then probably they're also as influential in Vietnam as well, right? So LG and those Korean electronics companies, right? So, and we think that that kind of Asian networks will make lots of interesting, will generate lots of interesting new industrialization hub across Asia, and that's not just big cities in China, but also other smaller cities in Southeast Asia or South Asia as well, right? So when we think about Vietnam, we think about Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi, right? But then how about Haiphong, right? So some cities that we haven't heard of, can become an industrial powerhouse going forward in Asia. Right? So if you are looking for the next, the footprint, these are the cities that you may want to pay attention to. That's the industrialization network. And let's talk about innovation network. Asia is also becoming a global innovation powerhouse. If you look at the top 10 tech companies in Asia, 10 years ago, there was no one from Asia, but today, about 4. And then about, 36% of the global unicorns are based in Asia. And then also, so that generates, lots of interesting, the landscape in Asia. So if you, especially in the digital ecosystem, you'll see, lots of interesting, digital innovators across Asia, right? And then, at first glance, right, so they seem to be quite different, right? So in terms of mobility, there's Didi in China, Ola in India, and Grab and Gojek in Southeast Asia, right? So the innovation seems to be highly local because it is founded by local entrepreneurs, and then they are supposed to meet local demand and then navigate local regulations, right? So innovation in Asia seems to be highly local, but at the same time, if you look at what is happening behind this innovation, it is highly intra-regional and highly multi in that sense. So we say, in Asia, so-called multi-local innovations are happening because if you look at the about 70% of the startup the funding in Asia are coming from intra-regional bases, right? So the capital and the inspiration and business models in Asia are flowing from one country to another, right? And this is forming a very interesting innovation network. And then again, that generates the Asian-style Silicon Valleys, right? So Beijing and Shenzhen, they are quite famous, right? But then, there are, many other, lesser-known cities becoming the next wave of Silicon Valley in Asia. For example, Jakarta. Indonesia has 5 unicorns. All of them are based in Jakarta, right? And if you think about India, we think about Bangalore, right, or Mumbai, right? But then there is a Hyderabad, right, so which is becoming the next software hub in India, right? So that kind of lesser known cities are becoming a new Silicon Valley in Asia. These are cities that you may want to pay attention to if you want to identify the next wave of innovation in Asia. Then the third network, third interesting network emerging in Asia is culture and mobility. Frank talked about entertainment, right? So who is this? BTS, yes. Right? So so these are Korean boy bands, right? But then they have a global influence, right? Because now Asia has enough scale, right? So to generate its own blockbuster, right? How about this? The Korean dramas, right? Yeah. So this is Mr. Sunshine, and then there's a so-called Korean wave, right? And then so this is a drama called Mr. Sunshine, and then they went live in Korea as well as in the world because Netflix. So they were able to broadcast it through Netflix. And then Netflix is also investing in original content generation across many different Asia, including Indonesia. Right? So some interesting, the content and cultural networks are getting formed, right? Because there's big enough demand in the region. How about this? So yoga festival, right? So yoga is from India, right? But then again, it's a global phenomenon, right? So and then also, the interesting people network is emerging in Asia, and then at the center of that, there is also China, right? So about 150 million outbound trips made by Chinese last year, and then when people go abroad, they bring in lots of related elements as well, right? So payment, right? So the food and so on and so on. So and then that spread the other ideas and cultural aspects across different Asia. Right? And then, where is this? So it's a great wall, right? So and as middle class consumers rise in China, they will start going global, and then as they global, there will be more and more opportunities, right? In terms of meeting their demand, in terms of culture and entertainment, and also, so that will generate lots of lesser known cities in Asia, and then give them opportunity to become a cultural hub. Right? So and finally, what does that mean? Right? So what does that mean? I think especially the first and second implication will matter to you, right? So to decision makers outside of Asia. First, think about how to be Asia relevant, right? So Asia-centric is already here, right? And then there are flows where Asia is already big and becoming dominant around the world, right? So then think about how you can be part of that flows, right? Whether that's trade or knowledge or and so on, right? So, but then there are also flows where Asia is still dependent on the other global inflows, right? So for example, education, right? So still lots of education flows happening in Asia. It goes to the West, right? Or more the advanced economies in the US and in the UK and so on, right? So then in order to stay relevant, how you can sustain your competitiveness, right? So that will be very, very important. Second is rethinking the Asian operating model, right? So Asia is big and complex and diverse, right? So therefore, don't try to manage Asia at a distance, right? So from a headquarters far away, right? So think about how you set up your local footprint, develop local insights to meet the local demand, right? And take advantage of this emerging Asian network. So those were the quick highlights from our first module. Happy to discuss further with other panelists as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I've been working in Asia. Was originally at HTC, ran their gaming video game business, and then did investing with the family office, and now an eSports team here in America. But to latch onto something that Jeongmin said in his talk was Asia is only getting more Asian, and also the rise of sort of the digital consumer, not only in China but around the world. And you see that a lot in eSports. I don't know how many of you people know what eSports here is, but it's basically competitive video games. People watch people play competitive video games more than the NHL now, more than the MLB. And so what you actually find is that in Asia, that's where people like to watch, more so than the NFL or the NBA nowadays. They like watching people play video games. And so that's a very Asian thing. In America, gaming has always been sort of a stigma. In China and Korea, it's a legitimate career. It's a legitimate thing to like to watch. It's a funny story. I mean, in high school, like the popular kids are the jocks, they're the football players, right? But if you go to China now, the coolest kid in school is the guy who was the best at video games, which is pretty funny. And to talk a little bit, expand that a little bit in terms of how China is very unique and growing, is that there's the advent of live streaming and the advent of digital consumerism in China and how it's very different from the American digital consumer. You hear about Netflix here, you hear about Hulu, Disney Plus is coming out. In China, it's completely different. Have you heard of companies like Douyin? Have you heard of companies like Douyu? Have you heard of companies like Huya? People love watching live streams. People watch live streams of not only people playing video games, but think about a guy teaching stocks, technical analysis, or someone driving a car and reviewing it at the same time live, or someone cooking, or someone singing. It's very, very Asian, and people need to understand that, where the Chinese consumer is so different. If you expand that even further to just, say, website content, here you're sort of Americans and the Western culture is all about design focus, very sleek. You're spoiled by Apple, it's very minimalist. In China, guess what? They want text everywhere. They want hyperlinks everywhere. So the Chinese consumer is very, very different. I don't have as much experience from a macro perspective of those sitting next to me, but I thought I'd give you a little bit of insight into sort of what I'm seeing on the ground floor from a digital consumer perspective and from a Chinese consumer perspective.
Great. Thank you very much. So, Terry, let me turn to you with a similar question. I know your specialty is technology and the internet. How does what Jeongmin was talking about in terms of the developments in Asia affect that?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for having me here. I appreciate it. So, as you appropriately stated, I'm very focused on technology, and especially from where value is going to get created. If you look across all the different sectors that exist and what gets produced, in general, technology-based sectors are where the growth is going to happen. Within technology, if you look at the areas of technology that are the areas that are happening the most today, Internet of Things, the idea that everything's going to be connected, cars and our bodies, etc. Cloud computing is another one where we're going to be able to access information very, very quickly, economically, etc. Super high-speed mobile networks, fifth-generation networks that are a gigabit a second or faster, that enable new applications like autonomous vehicles. They're going to enable telehealth, telemedicine solutions, etc. And then the last one, which I think is most notable, is artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is all the data that's being created from e-commerce, from social networks, from Internet of Things, all of that will create new insights. So why does all this matter, and what does it have to do with Asia? In many, many cases, you need large scale to have execution against these. So we're seeing today in the U.S., the number of antitrust claims against large U.S. tech companies is a manifestation of that. And most of the U.S. tech companies are saying, listen, we need scale to go execute on low cost, availability, unique insights, et cetera, et cetera. I took a group of MBAs from UCLA to Shenzhen and Hong Kong in March. It was the most eye-opening experience because what I saw were several things, and I would anchor a lot of my comments actually on China in a separate league from the rest of Asia. And the reason I say that is the scale that's required is so significant, and you see it happening in China. You, number two, see a willingness to adopt. So a bit of Walter's comments about unique traits and willingness to adopt, etc. You have to have that. And number three, you need to have a willingness of government in certain key areas to create opportunities for companies. So fifth generation networks, as an example, you need zoning that allows sites to go up. I'll give you one factoid. In China, they have begun deployment over 110,000 fifth generation base stations. The US is probably at 15,000, 15 or 20,000. And there's been a lot of zoning issues in the US that have slowed things down. So what is my message is you need large scale. And that to me happens in China. It's something obviously that will help the rest of Asia, but I think just China in and of itself matters. And there's important lessons for the US to say, are we going to, on a global basis, be able to compete well? And what are some of the best practices, the benchmarks, etc.? Because in many areas, China, I think, is eclipsing the US and some important lessons.
Thank you. So Terry, you kind of transitioned us a little bit into a focus on China. So let me pick up on that. I'm curious. Maybe Jeongmin wants to comment, or maybe any of the panelists on the current political situation, the tensions between the U.S. and China, the trade war. What are the implications of that in terms of the phenomena that you were describing, the growth of intra-Asian trade and so forth? Is what is happening now, would you say that that's accelerating those trends? And if a different president is elected and who has a different approach, will that slow down these trends, or is it not related at all?
I think what is happening is structural, right? So the China's rise, right? Whether China is the second largest economy in the world. There is maybe a day where China becomes the largest economy in the world, right? So then if you think about that from the global perspective, right? So it is structural, right? So therefore, how the U.S. is thinking about that, right? So the tension or the situation is likely to continue. And then, what that means to Asian countries is that we can create a stronger incentive for Asian countries to trade more and then for stronger collaboration, and then also in the industrialization network, there could be a acceleration of the footprint relocation from China to somewhere else, right? But then, if you think about from China perspective, China is not a trade-dependent country, right? So if you look at 2018, Chinese growth, about 70 to 80% of the Chinese growth came from domestic consumption. Same for the U.S., right? So these two countries are not necessarily dependent on trade, right? So therefore, if we talk about that trade dispute, that may continue, right? And then there is the bigger areas of negotiation, and then one example is technology, right? So China, especially in terms of core technology, China is still dependent on the foreign influence, right? So China's IP import is 6 times greater than IP export. And then also, if you look at the core component, if you think about electric vehicle, China is the largest electric vehicle market in the world, right? So it's a very, very successful story. And 90% of the market share is owned by domestic brands. Again, very successful story. But then if you look at the core components, like MCU, right? So IGBT, which is related to semiconductors, right? So those are imported from the foreign countries, right? So same thing for robotics market, right? So China is the largest robotics market in the world, right? But then some of the core components are from like servo motors or reduction gears. Those are coming from Japan, Europe, and the US, right? So therefore, from Chinese perspective, given what is happening, how they can manage the associated risk in the technology value chain, there will be a big agenda to address.
Yeah, so I think interestingly on China, if I were to separate it by short-term impact of the trade dispute and longer-term. Short-term, obviously, there's been a bunch of supply chain disruptions, U.S. technology companies that source manufacturing from China that's been disrupted. I think over time that'll settle. I actually would say there's a longer-term, more worrisome trend that, and you alluded to my previous role at the State Department. At the time of our treaty negotiations, 2012, there was a view that there could be some sort of alignment about a common view about the internet and internet governance. And I think the conventional wisdom today is we're basically seeing a bifurcation in the view of the internet. And that is creating a fundamental philosophical difference that's going to exist. One view is more the US view that says, listen, the government cannot solely be involved in the internet, in the transmission of content, etc. You need to have other parties involved to ensure there's no undue influence. And whether those other parties are the judicial system, whether it's industry, whether it's nonprofit organizations, etc., that you need to have others involved in the internet. What I think actually that overlays some of the interesting work here is I actually would say that there's these two different versions of internet span Asia. It's China and other countries that have a similar view about the role of government with the internet versus a US model. And I think this is where we're seeing it manifest in the discussions on Huawei. So infrastructure providers, if there's a view that there's going to be any type of filtering, censoring of content, then there's going to be a big wall set up. And that's why I think we're seeing this huge division. Now, where's to me the sweet spot? Because I take students to China and I talk to business leaders. I said, please don't get categorical and ideological completely on this. Separate out national security and law enforcement, which I think the U.S. is not going to agree with how the internet is being used. But there's a bunch of commercial applications that are benchmarked, that are, again, in transportation, that are in healthcare. If you go to, we went to Shenzhen, I don't know, you didn't have the picture there. That was amazing. The city's only 40 years old, and it looks like Manhattan, but it's all made up of Silicon Valley type companies. It's just an amazing transformation. Our students tried to pay when they went to have coffee and tea and lunch. It's a fascinating experience. No cash, no credit cards. Basically it's all through WePay, WeChat, etc. That is an example of a leapfrog technology that's happening. So to me, the interesting lessons are on the commercial side. And then the next level is saying, listen, as rising business leaders at UCLA or wherever else, if you could turn on and off a spigot about the role of government in marginal areas. So if we lightened up a little bit on our medical kind of data privacy, could we create much better health outcomes? My guess is China's going to eclipse the U.S., partly because of our effort. Transportation. My guess is autonomous vehicles. Probably China will eclipse the U.S. in that area. So I think it's important, as opposed to just getting ideological and say there's good and bad, to say, look at the commercial part, what are the learnings that come out of all that, and what can we do to replicate, learn, grow in that area and be successful.
Thank you. Walter, do you have any comments on this? Let me just pick up on that. I think it's not hard to envision an increasing competition between the U.S. and China in the key sort of technologies of the future, artificial intelligence and electric vehicles and clean energy and so forth. Depending upon how that evolves, do you think that companies and people in general will be in a situation of having to choose one model or the other, or will there be kind of a sweet spot, as you put it, where you can kind of take advantage of both?
Yeah, so I think if there's not a national security risk, then I think there'll be a lot of cooperation. I think potentially in autonomous vehicles, there could be a global standard and a lot of watch at what China is going to go do. When you get closer to content-related issues, social media as an example, is where there's going to be concern. If there's going to be messages and government influence, et cetera, I think those areas are going to be different. But you have business models. So, we've all followed the problems that Facebook has had with kind of lax advertising and a variety of things. Well, their latest move to get into their own mobile pay solution is, to me, them watching Tencent and saying, we need a super app that has all of these great services to diversify our activities. We need to make money, not just from advertising. So there's a bunch of things that are learnings, and there may be more business models that are Chinese ones without using companies that are there, but just watching what's happening.
Let me ask another question before we open it up to the audience, and that is venture capital. Jeongmin, I think somewhere in your study you talked about how much venture capital is coming out of China now. You had somewhere in there that India actually provided 3 times as much venture capital as Germany, if I have that right. What are the implications of that in terms of the businesses that we're talking about?
Yeah. So the implication is that there are lots of opportunities in Asia, right? So the innovation, by definition, is to solve problems, right? And then in Asia, there are lots of problems to solve, right? And then also, there's also lots of inspiration and talent and business models coming across from each other, right? So the Chinese model you talked about, payment, right? And also the mobility, healthcare, AI, those business models are quite relevant in other parts of the Asia because they also suffer from lack of access to banking or credit history or limited resource in healthcare, huge traffic jam and so on and so on, right? So and that's why so these days one of the trend is that think about what the models that work well in China or advanced part of the Asia and then take it to the emerging Asia or frontier Asia and then apply it, right? And then also lots of joint venture or partnership or acquisition is happening across Asia. So digital innovation in Asia is not just a story of China, but also the story of many other Asias. And then in that sense, India offers a fantastic opportunity. And also, if you look at the internet users, right? So the Philippines and Vietnam, those countries are one of the heaviest internet users, right? Once they get on the digital platform, internet platform, they go crazy about the eSports, right, or the internet content, right, or the using those they become a consumer of those applications, right? So therefore, there are still lots and lots of opportunities for a venture capitalist to bring in new technologies and deploy interesting business.
Yeah, I'd like to, from a venture capitalist perspective, because we do a couple of direct investments in Asia. From that perspective, everyone talks about, when people talk about Asia, they always think about China. And people forget about Asia's other countries. And actually, some of those other countries are more interesting from a venture capital perspective than China is. I'm talking about Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, these types of countries. Because if you look at China, it's a very saturated market now. All the big guys are there. You're talking about Sequoia, Andreessen's, everyone's there in China. So to compete with those VC firms, it's not realistic. But if you talk about places like Indonesia, Vietnam, those more underserved sort of countries, there's not many third-party independent venture capital funds. They're talking about mostly family offices in those areas, in those countries. And so if you look at a country like Indonesia, has 300 million people, same size as the United States. You know that is the most active and social media users in the world are in Indonesia. Jakarta is the single most active Facebook city in the entire world. And that's why Facebook focuses so much on Indonesia. People don't understand that, and that's why there's so much more opportunity in those even more developing countries, because a lot of them have even more basic technology needs that need to be met, which means much more opportunity for venture capital funds, for entrepreneurs who have more interesting ideas on how to solve those.
Yeah, can I check? I think it's important too, because I agree with Walter, to make the distinction between what is an attractive end market to sell to versus where the technology is going to get created. So I think actually McKinsey's done some really interesting work about kind of superstar nations, etc. I actually think, again, there's a separate cut here that is large nations. So the US, China, to a certain degree India, I think will be in advantaged positions in creating the technology. We just had an event at UCLA, and I'm from the Bay Area, so I'll give you my conflict, because they talked about the Silicon Beach and all that. I said people confuse when they answer the question is, Los Angeles tech-oriented. They sometimes confuse what is a huge end market with lots of users from where the technology is getting created. And you want to be where the technology is being created, everything else being held equal. That's where value creation is. That's where high-paid jobs are, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think there is a kind of a large-scale play here to watch out for. One of my students, and I have a good relationship with him, so I can ask him the question. He's from Singapore, and I said, "Gosh, Singapore is such an affluent, market off. But what is going to happen in the future when you need large domestic markets? You need access to lots of great data scientists, etc. You're going to have a disadvantaged position." So I do think there's a large versus small in the creation area that matters.